Although a good many of you have heard or have read articles written about the inception of AA, there are probably some who haven't. And from that brief story, there are some things to be learned. So, even at risk of repetition, I would like to relate just exactly what did happen in those very early days. And I feel there is a lesson to be learned, and one that we must never forget if we wish to maintain paid-up insurance policies against our drinking. You recall the story about Bill having having had some spiritual experience, having been sold on the idea of attempting to be helpful to others. You undoubtedly recall the fact that he had been working quite hard at it for around 5 months or so, almost incessantly, and still had not created, if you please, a single convert. Not one. As we express it, no one had jailed. But he had worked tirelessly with no thought of saving his own strength or time or anything. But nothing seemed to register. When he business mission, which turned out to be quite a, but didn't know it, he was tempted and be a king, and his teachings led him to believe, avoid getting into difficulties if he found some alcoholic. And spying the name of our good friend Reverend Walter on the bulletin board in the lobby of the Mayflower, he called up the good doctor and asked him the names of some of the group of people with whom he had been affiliated and through whose instrumentality he had acquired sobriety. The good doctor said he wasn't one, but he knew of quite a number, and he gave him quite a little list, I guess about 9 or 10 of them. So Bill starts to call them up without very much success. They had either just left town, or they were just leaving town, or they were having a party, or they had a sore toe or something. Anyway, they came down to the end, or at least very nearly the end, and his eye lights on the name Mrs. and happened to get our good friend Henrietta. But he called up good Henry and told her what he wanted, and she said, come right out and have lunch with him. So out he went and went into his story in considerable detail, and she said, I have just the man for you. So she rushes to the phone and calls up Anne and tells her that she has just the fellow to be helpful to Bob, and we should come over. And he said, well, I guess we better not go over today. But Henry is very persistent, very determined individual. He said, oh yes, come on over. I know it'll be helpful to Bob. Well, Henry didn't think it was quite wise for us to come over there, and finally Henry bore in to such an extent that she had to tell her that I was very much in the sack, and has in fact passed all capabilities for listening to any conversation, and it would just possibly have to be postponed. So she starts in the next day, having invited, being Sunday and Mother's Day, and we said that, our aunt said we would be over. Well, I don't ever remember feeling much worse. But being very fond of Henry and having said we'd go over, we started over, and I extracted the solemn promise from man on the way over that 15 minutes of this stuff was tops. That I didn't want to talk to this mug or anybody else, and we'd really make it snappy. Now, these are actual facts. We got there at 5 o'clock, and it was 11:15 when we left. Now, you know, or possibly your memories are good enough to carry you back to certain times when you haven't felt too good, and you can easily visualize the fact that you wouldn't have listened to anybody unless that individual had really had something to tell you. And that's the way I felt about Bill. And I recognized the fact that he did have something, and so I listened those many hours. And I stopped drinking immediately. But very shortly after that, there was a medical meeting in Atlantic City. And I developed a terrific thirst for knowledge. I had to have knowledge. So I would go to Atlantic City and absorb lots of knowledge. I usually mention the fact that I incidentally had acquired a thirst for scotch, but I didn't mention that. But anyway, I went to Atlantic City and really hung one on. And when I came to, I was in the home of a friend of ours in Cuyahoga Falls, one of our suburbs. And Bill came over and got me home, gave me a hooker or two of scotch that night and a bottle of beer the next morning. And that was on the 10th of June of '35, and I have had no alcohol in any form that I know of since. Now, the interesting part of all this are not all these sordid details, but the condition that we two fellas were in. We had both been associated with the same bunch of people. He in New York and I in Akron. I had been associated with them, in fact, for 2 years and a half. He for 5 months. He had acquired this idea of service, and that I had not. But I had done an immense amount of reading, which they recommended. I had refreshed my memory on the good book, and I'd had an excellent training in that as a youngster. They told me that I should go to their meetings regularly, and I did every week. They said I should affiliate myself with some church, and we did that. And they also said that I should cultivate the habit of prayer. And I did that, at least to quite a considerable extent for me. But I got tight every night. And I mean that. It wasn't once in a while. It was practically every night. And I couldn't understand what was wrong. I had done all these things that these good people told me to do. Every one of them. And I thought very faithfully and sincerely, but I still continued to overindulge. But the one thing that they hadn't told me was the one thing that Bill had. The instruction to attempt to be helpful to somebody else. So we immediately started to look around for prospects, and it wasn't long before one appeared in the form of a man whom you all know, at least a great many of you know, a good friend of Akron. Now, I knew that this Bill was Sunday school superintendent. And I also thought that he probably forgot more about the good book every night than I ever knew. And who was I to be trying to tell him about it? And it made me feel somewhat hypocritical. It is quite a job for me to talk to him on that sort of subject. But anyway, we both did, and I'm very glad to say the conversation fell on fertile ground. Then in October, we had 3 dumped in our laps almost simultaneously. But the point I wanted to bring out was the fact that in my mind the spirit of service is of prime importance, although it has to be backed up with some knowledge of the subject. I know I used to go to the hospital and I'd stand there and talk. I've talked many a time to a chap in a bed for 5 or 6 hours. I don't know how he ever stood me for 5 or 6 hours, but he did. Probably we'd hidden his clothes or something. But anyway, it came to my mind that I probably didn't know too much about what I was talking. Therefore, we being stewards of what we have, and that includes our time, I was not giving a good account of my stewardship of time. If it took me 6 hours to say something to this man that I could have said in an hour, we'll say, if I'd known what I was talking about, I certainly was not a very efficient individual. And incidentally, I'm somewhat allergic to work anyway. So I felt that I should continue to increase my familiarity not only with the good book, but read a good deal of good standard literature and possibly something of scientific interest along with it. So I did cultivate this habit of reading, and I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that I have probably averaged to read an hour a day for the last 15 years. Now, I don't say that to try to sell you on the idea that you've got to cultivate that habit of reading an hour a day, because there are plenty of people and fine AAs that don't read very much. You see, back in those days, we were groping in the dark entirely. We did not know much about it. We knew practically nothing of alcoholism. A physician, knew nothing about it to speak of. Oh, I'd read about it, but there wasn't anything worth reading in any of the textbooks. And usually the information about it consisted on some queer treatment for DTs if you'd gone that far, and if you hadn't, why, you prescribed a few bromides and gave the fellow a good lecture, none of which, of course, amounted very much.